our speaker for the day, Jim Fox. Jim is going to be presenting how he's going to proceed with the study, the equity study, salary study essentially. And he'll go step by step through the process, and at the end of it, you'll have an opportunity to ask whatever questions you may have about the project. And Jim, go ahead.
Sure. Good morning. Let me just tell you a little bit about who we are. So there's going to be 3 people working on this project. Myself, I'm the project director. That means that I have to make sure that I meet your needs as well as professional standards. Mike Verdorn is going to be doing a lot of the analysis, looking at for the professional administrative jobs, looking at the job descriptions, identifying the matches, and basically verifying the data that we've collected. And Chu-Young Pan is going to be doing the market analysis. In other words, she's going to be collecting the market data for the jobs that we want to match. Now, the approach is going to be a little bit different for faculty versus the professional administrative. I'll try to clarify those differences as I go along. But these are the 3 people that are going to be working on the project. Mike has got a master's in HR. Chu-Young Pan also has a master's in HR. Mike's been working with me for about 8 years. Chu-Young has been with us about a year now. So those are the people. Who are we? Well, what we do is classification compensation studies. We work all over the country. We've done some international work as well. Been doing this for a long time. A lot of experience with colleges and universities throughout the country, community colleges, 4-year master's granting institutions, much like yours. You can find other information about us at our website if you like. We have a lot of articles about compensation that we write about. Some of the recent clients, I just thought I'd highlight some of these. University of Wisconsin-Green Bay is very much like you. They're a master's granting institution. They have about 5,600 students, which is about what you have, I believe. And they're a part of a University of Wisconsin system, so they have some flexibility and some restrictions on how they identify and adjust pay. We just finished that about 3 or 4 months ago. The University of Maine, we looked at all of their non-classified, or their classified jobs, which would be the non-exempt, the lower level administrative assistant kind of jobs. And there were about 2,000 employees that we looked at there. University of Minnesota, a variety of different projects there, including the athletic directors and the athletic coaches' jobs, which is kind of a unique experience all by itself, since their compensation seems to have no limit. If you've watched any of the football coaches' salaries. Alcorn State in Mississippi, they don't even have a compensation system, so we're putting one together for the first time. This does not include faculty, so it's all the staff. And then Northeastern Illinois and a number of others. West Virginia is kind of unique because they have a statewide policy that says we have to have one pay schedule for all of our institutions of higher ed. Community colleges, 4-year schools, University of West Virginia. They have an osteopathic school there, and so that's kind of a unique experience there. And then some of these others around the country that you may or may not be familiar with. So why a compensation study? For us, this started quite a while ago, and we finally gotten to this point. But what we're trying to address is to identify what the salary and benefits market is for comparable jobs. Now, for faculty, it's pretty straightforward by rank, assistant, associate, full. We're still debating about lecturers and that sort of thing, but you know, why? Yeah, why? We're not sure it was included in the scope of work. And so, why would we ever include it?
This is not the first time something like this has happened. Lecturers are never included. We're only counted as faculty when it's time to add us in to drop the mean. That's the only time we're counted as faculty.
Okay.
All right, so I would recommend 3 places. You have tenured faculty, tenured track,
Right.
lecturers,
Right.
professional staff. You have to separate lecturers out entirely.
Well, we would. We would if we collected that information. So, I mean, we wouldn't group them into professors or that tenure track comparison. So that would be a distinct comparison.
So does the study include lectures?
Well, we're still debating. We haven't had much time to discuss it.
My expectation
So,
is that it will.
Because if
But
it doesn't,
whether
I'm wasting my time.
it's, sorry.
Because if it does not, I'm wasting my time here. I mean, why would we participate in this? Can we get a definitive on this?
I will do the best I can to include lectures in the study.
does that help?
No.
Okay. For the professional administrative, what we're going to be looking at are comparable jobs that we can find in other higher ed organizations as well as some in the private sector. So for example, Ralph's job, HR director, we can find in private sector organizations, so we'll probably look there as well as other colleges and universities. So we're going to collect that information and compare it to what you are being paid here to identify if there's a difference, what the difference is, and then what the resolution might be. We're also going to look at race and gender to identify whether there's any impact, intentional or unintentional, to identify whether there's any impact on those, by those characteristics on pay. And then one of the processes that we are going to be going through is to identify a compensation philosophy or strategy. And basically a compensation philosophy says, where do we want to compare ourselves? Now I know that you have a group of peer institutions, and we want to make sure that that's the right peer group for what we're looking at, and whether there might be other peers or comparisons that we want to look at. Where do we want to be in relationship to those organizations? And how do we resolve any inequities or any pay disparities between what you're paid and what the market is paid? So we will have those processes. Now sometimes when we get involved in these studies, people get excited about, you know, this is going to cut our pay, this is going to impact us negatively, jobs are going to be reduced. That's not what we're hired to do, so we're not going to make any recommendations in those areas. So sometimes that's on people's worry lists. You should just take that off your list. But what we are going to do is try to identify the appropriate labor market for the jobs that you have in your organization, and then identify what the competitive rate is, see what the difference is, what the cost would be to bring salaries to that competitive rate, or a competitive rate that is affordable. For those professional jobs, we want to look at the internal equity, in other words, job value in relationship to the pay, so that we have a good relationship between those characteristics, and that pay isn't influenced by race or gender. So we've got 5 steps, basically 4 which are technical, and then the final report. So I want to go over each one of these. Talked a little bit about the pay strategy, also kind of getting to understand what this organization is all about, some of the history and issues and concerns. This is my 2nd day on campus. It's about my 3rd hour on campus. So I'm learning through these meetings as we go in terms of your comments and issues and that sort of thing. We're also reviewing policies, past practices in terms of pay. Found out yesterday, for example, there was a faculty group or Senate committee that focused on internal equity. So we're kind of exploring what that was all about and how that was dealt with, and those sorts of issues. So that's part of the process. And then the other process is the pay strategy. Now we put together a straw man strategy. And basically that means here's what we think makes sense. Now let's talk about modifying it or adjusting it for your circumstances. And that will continue throughout the entire project. So that's not something that just has a final date until we get to the end. Because oftentimes we say we want to have a strategy that pays our everyone at this level, and then we find out that it costs $10 million. Well, maybe there's a migration strategy, you know. And so that usually waits till the end. Now for the professional jobs and the administrative jobs, we're going to be looking at job descriptions to identify that we understand those jobs, and then identify the jobs that we can find good market data for. So not all of the jobs we're going to be able to find good market data for. On every organization, there's a job or two or three or four that is very unique to this or that organization. And we're probably not going to be able to find good comparable data. Yes?
Cost of living.
Yes.
Differences between, let's say, Pueblo might be 87% of the national average.
Right.
Boulder might be, 135% of the national average.
Probably not, but yes.
How will those cost of living formulas play here because we're Pueblo?
A good question in terms of how the cost of living or geographic differentials of cost of living impact. What we do is we collect the raw data, and then we find out where the data came from. We go to a third party called Economic Research Institute. They're in Seattle, or just outside of Seattle. And they have what's called geographic differentials for pretty much every location. You familiar with them? They have a proprietary formula that takes into account we use the cost of labor index. And the cost of labor is not only what other organizations are paying for the same job, but also takes into account some cost of living factors. So let's say that we get data from New York City, and it's an absolutely perfect match. We say, well, obviously New York City pays more, costs more to live there. What would the adjustment be? So let's say the salary is $40,000 and it's 15% lower here in Pueblo. We're going to reduce that by 15%. Yeah. And so we're probably going to represent the data as raw data and then adjusted data. So we take into account those conditions. Now, you have a group of 11 peers that apparently is approved by the Board of Governors, and we want to look at that. There's also probably other organizations in the regional area that we want to look at. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that list and probably add to it. And the characteristics, I'll talk about those characteristics that we're going to look at in a bit. We'll collect the salary data. For faculty, it'll be all of the ranks. And for the benchmarks, it'll be for their specific benchmark for the professional administrative classes. We will collect the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile of the market data, so we get a good identification of the range of data that is out there. And then we'll identify where you are in relationship to that. And that's partly due to the strategy. So let's say that we want to pay at the middle of the market. Most organizations target that as their pay strategy. But let's say that we're paying below that. Well, what would it cost to bring everybody up to that level? And not only to bring the jobs or the ranks up to that level, but then we're going to go further and we're going to say for every individual, based on their seniority and or performance, depending on the quality of the performance data, where should they be in relationship to that? So maybe they've been here for 30 years and they've been outstanding performance. They probably ought to be paid above that middle mark. Somebody who's just hired, perhaps paid less than that middle mark. But all of that will go through. And then if the cost is more than we have money for, we'll identify whether there's a year-by-year transition plan.
Would
Yeah.
that be rank and discipline as well? Is it discipline?
Yeah, for faculty, we'll look at discipline. We can get data, I think, for all of the disciplines that you have here. So, yeah.
Are these all the male factors in formula that you're going to apply, or are you going to do this on a case-by-case basis?
It's going to be, first of all, it's going to be a formula-based, so that everybody's treated equally. And then we'll provide that back to the university, and to the extent anything happens after that, that may be a more case-by-case basis with your dean or department head or whatever the case may be.
I thought I heard you say, sorry for going away, I thought I heard you say you're going to try to meet with the faculty compensation committee? That's the
No, I've heard that there has been one, and there have been certain policies in terms of internal equity. And so I just learned about that yesterday.
Okay, we've asked the provost to try to let us meet with you as initial response.
Oh, okay.
You should just attend these meetings, but we would like to meet with you.
All right.
as an individual committee
All right.
if possible.
Yeah. So here's the comparisons for the peers that we normally start off with. Obviously, Carnegie classification, students, budget, programs, geographic location. We're probably not going to select a whole bunch of East Coast institutions. But starting from that peer list that already exists at 11, we'll probably add some Western states or mountain states. Tuition is also another characteristic. Sometimes you say, here's a perfect match, but their tuition is twice as much as yours or half as much as yours. And so is that really a good comparison? I mean, it's a question. I don't know if I have the perfect answer for. State or private. And then for the professional administrative, the private sector organizations that we'll look at. Compare, you know, once we get that data, compare to current pay and identify any differences. Now, we're going to do what's called a pay compression analysis. Pay compression takes a number of different forms. There can be between rank compression as well as within rank. And as I understand the internal equity process, that was more of a within rank comparison.
Mostly compression cases.
Yeah.
Very little external comparison.
Yeah. So we're going to take a look at that to identify what we can do, what sort of process might alleviate that. Pay compression by itself, you know, I've been doing this for a long time. You never get rid of it. You can reduce it, but you never get rid of it. As soon as you hire a new employee, you probably got a new compression issue.
Can I ask
So,
a couple questions?
yeah.
First one is, why go outside of the peers since we've spent some effort and identified a large number of factors to establish that? What's the rationale for adding to that peer group?
Well, just my limited experience. I talked to the Dean of Business. He said when he looks at his peers, he looks at those 11 peers, and then he looks at some of the mountain states, master's, comprehensive, small, I guess is what it would be, and says where do we line up on those as well? So he's got kind of a couple of benchmark comparisons to identify. So, you know, I could just take the peers. It's a decision that we haven't made yet. So if everyone said, yeah, just look at those 11 peers, that's fine. You know,
I asked the question because the school businesses actually use a different interpretation of who they're comparing themselves to than the rest of the university, which has then led to some, you know, compression stuff that's college and college. Not
yeah, I don't want to pit one school against another.
right.
So if the consensus is no, let's look at these peers alone, that's fine. If the consensus is no, we ought to include some others as well, just to get a good base, then we'll do that.
And my second question had to do with your formulaic approach. Assuming you're starting with a reference point to a group of peers and medians from those groups,
Yeah.
building the formula on that basis, compression already is going to exist in that. So how do you do that compression in the same formula?
What do you mean the compression is
Well,
going to?
if we use a formula that basically says, okay, you know, I'm 5 years in rank, and the median in my particular field of expertise is $50,000.
Yep.
You know, and essentially drive the formula from that, including the other factors that you mentioned. If that formula is referencing something that's already compressed data, which virtually every university has compression already built.
You mean the market data represents compressed data?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how to resolve that. I mean, it is what it is. So, I mean, that's beyond my brain power, unless you've got a solution.
Well, what occurred to me is that you maybe come up with those initial, you use your formula, come up with initial salaries, and then come at the compression after that, right? Like it's a second wave.
Well, for example, let's say in your discipline, 50,000 is the median.
Right.
And of course, that represents salaries that are, who knows how they're decided in these other institutions, but that's what it is. Then we're going to look at within this organization, where do people line up versus in that discipline at that rank against that 50,000?
Right.
Are they above that or below that? If they're above that, is there a an objective reason why that exists. An objective usually is how long you've been in that rank and performance. Now, I know there's other characteristics, but those two are very simple.
Performance being merit here, merit ranking.
Yeah. And so then we come to well, even the algorithm and how you apply that is a bit of subjective. So do you say, well, for every year they've been at that rank, that should be equivalent to some level of salary? Or for every 2 years, that ought to be equivalent to some level of salary? So there's all that detail just in building that algorithm there's a bit of subjectivity in that process. So we try to apply it very simply at first to get a baseline, and then we can make an adjustment based on further discussions.
So as an example, when we did our last salary study back in 2005, using probably a very similar formulaic approach, the time to rank was weighted in a way where if you in fact increased rank, you actually ended up with a lower adjustment than somebody who had stayed in the same rank. So you were disadvantaged by having advanced in the way the formula worked. So we didn't really realize that until the formula had been applied and people's salaries had already been adjusted, and then we had to spend a year trying to
Readjust. Yeah.
This is why we heavily emphasize, and I recognize you just hearing this yesterday, maybe
Yeah.
for those.
Right.
The compensation committee would really like to talk to you about, what's happened before. Take a look at your formula, and ideally, you take a look at the data before we do anything with it, so we can see those problems before we, because that ended up being basically 2 or 3 years ago, dealing with individual equity cases.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be opportunities to look at the data, compare, think about it, see what it might mean.
Just trying to make our case to that, right? I think that could help us avoid those kind of problems this time.
Yeah. Good point. So the rest of this is basically figuring out, what's the cost impact, and usually there's a million solutions, but we usually identify a least cost, and then a most cost, and then somewhere in between. And even somewhere in between might be too expensive, and so it may require some time to implement. But we won't know that until we get to that point. Won't know that. The race and gender analysis, these are normally the characteristics that we're going to look at. So we'll throw that into the formula, see if there's any impacts, any of these which show up as statistically significant, and then we'll probably rerun it to perfect the model to identify whether there's any issues that we need to address. We'll do that for both faculty as well as professional administrative. Now, we may find some outliers, and that may require us to go into a personnel file and say, why is this person of this race and gender paid this much? That seems to be impacted by either race or gender. Can't be explained away by any of the other variables. And so we would probably identify those people, and that may require someone, not us, to look further into their personnel file to say, that's the reason, or we can't find a reason. I don't, whatever the case may be. Put all of that together in a presentation, findings, recommendations, transition plans, system maintenance issues, presentation to the President, Cabinet, and then it's kind of up to them in terms of how they go about it. So this is the timeline. I think we're going to be able to do this faster than this, but just wanted to put this out. This is what we originally planned. Again, this has been a long time in process, but here we are at this date. Now, outcome is obviously going to be affected by the strategy, our experience in doing this kind of work, and the market data that we collect. And then obviously the recommendations or any implementation will be based on financial capabilities and President's decision, as well as our decision-making process that goes on within this university. I mean, we're not going to impede upon that process. All the tough questions, have Ralph answer those. If you have an issue that you want to address, you don't really care to share with anybody else, you can email me at this address. Just let me know where you're from, because I give this out to all of my clients, so I'd like to know that, if it's from here, at least I'm answering it within this context, because I'm not answering it within another university's context. So, questions? Yes, sir.
When you said that performance goes into the equation, I'm assuming you just mean someone's APR score?
I don't know what APR.
What do you mean by performance?
Well, I put this out in terms of performance being their annual performance review. Is that what the APR is? That's brilliant. But I got to tell you, most organizations, while they do performance evaluations on an annual basis, there's not a great deal of faith in those. And so I put it out there because I think it's something that we ought to account for, but most of the time, when I suggest that, they say, we don't want you to use performance data because we don't have any confidence in it. If you do, we can. I mean, we have done that before, but I've got to ask that question, whether it's good data.
So for instance, if you take performance out of the equation completely, and this is just an example, but say somebody's been here for 10 years or whatever, and they consistently, do well in their teaching evaluations for whatever they're worth, but they don't publish anything. And someone that's been here 10 years gets high teaching evaluations, but also publishes a lot. How can that be taken into consideration if the second person is getting paid a lot more already because of the higher performance?
Well, if you take those two and weight them equally, you can say, here's two 10-year term people. One has good performance evaluations, one has none. Likely the one with good performance evaluation, it would substantiate to a higher degree the level of pay that they have. And the other one, since you have nothing in performance, probably would diminish the impact of the 10-year track record.
I guess I'm just trying to get a feel for whether more weight is simply given to this person who's been here a long time and someone hasn't been here a long time.
Yeah.
So because this person's only been here 5 years, they're making this much, and someone's been here for 15 years and they're making less. Let's freeze this person's salary and then focus on the one who's been here a long time. Is more weight given to that?
We start off with a 50-50 weight and then adjust it based on conversations and considerations for the data. Yeah.
So that was just, sorry, I don't want to take up all your time.
No, it's a good question.
One other question I had,
Yeah.
You said recommendations weren't given in terms of, trying to cut people's salary, but do you make recommendations about freezing them for a certain period of time?
We have in the past, and that is an institutional decision. Some organizations will say that's very nice to know, but we're not going to freeze anybody's salaries. Other organizations will say, yeah, we're going to freeze those that are quote unquote overpaid. Yeah. I mean, that's a loaded term, but in the professional administrative jobs, it's a little cleaner because normally there are salary ranges that are very specific to that job. So you can say, yeah, nobody's paying more than X in the market. So if this person is paid more than X, maybe we should not pay that person. Now, there may be other conditions as to why you should, but the least that we can do is give you an identification of what or who those people are and what that overpayment is. Yes,
Does the equity study include all the ranks?
Yes.
Deans and provosts and presidents?
I don't know if we're going to include the president. The president's usually on their own planet. Well, I mean, the salary decided for the president is out. It's hardly ever impacted by a study like this, unless the boards hires me to do exactly that study. Yeah.
Second question, it's tough times everywhere. I would like to dream that we're going to come out with recommendations from your group saying that we need to boost our salaries.
Sure.
Do you keep track of how many institutions are actually able to follow through on the recommendations you make?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I've been doing this for a long time, probably 30 years, and I know of 5 organizations that have not implemented some part of our recommendations. And the differences between what the market is paying and what my client is paying sometimes will vary as low as 1% to 25%. Now, obviously, the 25% can't make that up in 2 or 3 or 4 years. One of my clients was in North Dakota. They were 18% below the market. They took 8 years, but they finally got there. They just legitimately added another percent than what the market was moving at. And so after that period of time, and due to turnover and so on and so forth, they were able to get to the market. Now they're right on target. But I think there's only 5 or so that I can remember that have basically said, thank you very much, and then put it on the shelf. Yet I think they do that to their own detriment, to be honest with you, because once you open up this can of worms, you can't put the worms back in. You really can't. Oh, yes.
So in terms of putting the worms back in, once you come up with your findings and your recommendation, how much of that information is made public to all of the employees here?
Oh, well, when we get done and we go through this process, wherever this process is, this final report, I'm going to prepare a PowerPoint presentation which basically has all of the information in it. Some detail might be in Excel spreadsheets, it won't be in the presentation, but usually I come back to campus and say, here's what I found. Here's what I'm recommending. And so we have other meetings like this to say, here's what we know.
And so that information goes to all the employees versus just
Yep.
the cabinet?
Yep. I have no more to say. Thank you for your attendance. Appreciate it.